you heard. First of all, I'm sorry about that photograph. It is absolutely dreadful. As you can see from the screen, I'm a much more handsome gentleman in real life than any photograph would do justice to. So, and also we're still waiting for Peter to join us. So if Peter doesn't join us, I'm going to have to handle his side of the webinar as well. So what I want to start off with, I want to just go through these 3 slides first of all. Okay, so we're going to go through the 3 papers just as an overview of what you students will expect in 2 years. There's obviously been some massive changes, and the IB's given us kind of like a jigsaw, and they've thrown it up in the air, and they're expecting us to collect all the pieces and put our own courses together. So that's kind of like how you should see the course. So we're here to help you put the pieces together. The book should be seen as like a toolkit to help you create your own course. But for obvious reasons, we can't write a course into the book. The book has to be the pieces that allow you to create your own course. So I'm starting with the papers. That's usually called backwards planning. I like to view backwards planning as it's a very good way to think about courses. I like to start with not just with what students will be asked. I like to start off with what students will write. So go even further than just the assessment questions. So before we go today, you should understand that Peter and myself are going to be available for your questions after the webinar is over. If you want to keep asking Pearson questions, then Peter and I are going to answer them. And we're also going to upload lots of resources on what Pearson called an Active Learn ebook platform. So you subscribe to the website, and then Peter and I, and hopefully Ellen, will upload our resources. What we're going to be uploading in the coming weeks is things like more than one set of spec questions. So the IB's released one set of spec questions. I think that we will be writing more spec questions for Pearson, and then we'll also be writing lots of spec answers, what I call excellent example answers, so EEAs. And those EEAs are going to be written to a speed of about 20 words per minute. So you can see here on the right of the screen, we've got marks and then we've got timings. So the timings are my suggestions. It's not the IB, so you shouldn't confuse that with the IB. Sometimes when I'll speak in terms of the third person. So I'll say what the IB thinks and then what Bryan thinks. It's not a very nice way to speak, but I just wanted to distinguish between what the IB says and what I say, so that you don't go away confused. So this is what paper 1 looks like. If you think about the new paper 1, it's kind of like a condensed version of the old paper 1 and paper 2. So they've taken the old paper 1 and paper 2 and they've stuck it into one paper. So you've got section A, which is 2 compulsory short answer questions. These are only worth 4 marks each. This is the only place where the students are going to be asked to explain content from the content with a big C on its own, in its pure form. And by the way, you need to get used to this idea of the 3 C's, right? Concepts, content, and contexts. So when I talk about them, I'll try and I'll label them as big C's. So that we can distinguish between content with a small c, which is what's in the book, and then content with a large C, which is what the IB means, as biological, sociocultural, cognitive, and research methods. So section A is the only place that they're going to answer those questions in a pure, unadulterated form, where there's no contexts and there's no concepts. And you can see here we're going to give them 20 minutes. And then you've got section B, which is 2 compulsory short answer questions. And they're asking students to apply knowledge to a new situation, which will be pretty mainstream and pretty reasonable. It'll be things like psychologists in schools measuring students' ability, or a psychology researcher trying to measure the effectiveness of a drug, et cetera, et cetera. A reasonable mainstream psychology situation. The idea of the new guide is to turn students into, is to make them psychologically literate. And to make them understand psychology in the real world rather than rote memorizing knowledge. So that's the basic aim. And then you've got section C, which is extended response questions. And the point of paper 1, section C, is to combine the contexts with the content and the concepts. Okay, and that's the place where they're expected to do extended response questions. So paper 1 is there's the only one place that kind of mimics the old paper 1 and paper 2. Moving on to paper 2. I don't know why it's not letting me. There we go. Paper 2. Paper 2 is going to be an opportunity for the students to demonstrate their knowledge of their new class practical. So they're going to do 4 class practicals, each for the new contexts, and they're going to answer questions about it. They will need to have knowledge of their class practical, and this is the place where the class practical will be assessed. They won't write the class practical in your lessons and then send it off to the IB to be assessed. This is the place where they're going to have their knowledge of their class practical assessed, and then they're going to be transferring that knowledge to a conceptual situation. So the new paper 2, as you can see, the only content they need with a small c is of their class practicals. And I've given you the timings on the far right of the screen. And then paper 3, similar to the old paper 3, but in the sense that it's assessing research methods. This is going to be the high level part of the course. But the difference here is that they are expected to use sources. So it's a bit like if you teach history or global politics, they're expected to read sources and then combine that knowledge in the end question 4, which is an essay question. The only part of this paper where they're going to need HL knowledge in its explicit written form is going to be question 4. So that raises the question as to how much we really need to teach the HL extensions, because while the sources will be in the context with a small c or the context with a large C, you won't need that much outside information to understand them. The only place you're going to need explicit information to answer a question is question 4, where they combine their own knowledge with the information in the sources. And I've been playing around with example answers and trying to write my own answers recently. And to get high marks, it's my opinion that they're not going to need that much to get. When I say that much, I'm talking about the knowledge of the high level extensions. They're not going to need that much. Most of the marks in question 4 are going to be arguments made from the sources. So question 3, source-based paper, where they combine the knowledge in the sources with their own knowledge. So that's an introduction to the 3 papers. And then on top of that, you've got the new IA, which, as we all should know by now, they don't actually carry it out. And the point of that is to help them understand psychology in the real world a bit more, so they're not just confined to their school environment, so they can actually go out and propose research in a kind of like a real psychological environment. Okay, so everything you see on the screen is being made available to you. So I'm just going to flip through these slides now. I'll do it quite quickly. I'm not going to read everything from the slides. I've only got about another 8 or 9 minutes before I hand over to Peter anyway. So we're going to kind of jump through them a little bit. I'm just going to pick out what's important. So on this slide, what's new is these 3 C's: concepts, content, and contexts. Peter and I are going to offer you the 4th C, which is confidence. That's going to be our 4th C from Pearson. So if you buy the book, if you subscribe to the ebook, it'll give you confidence to deliver the course. In terms of the 3 C's, the contexts should be seen as the anchor of the course. So you've got 4 contexts. That's your anchor. So if you want to split, if you in your head, if you want to split the course into easy pieces or chunks, then you should see the context as your big chunk. So you've got 4, and then you've got your IA, and then you've got your research methods for high level. But don't forget the research methods for us also needs to be taught for standard level as well, but they won't be explicitly examined in the exam. So you've got your 4 big contexts, and we are expected to interact with the content and the concepts in the context with a small c of the contexts. And one of the things that you should be aware of by now is that we're all going to get very bored of saying content, context, and concepts for the next 7 years. It's going to be a bit of a mouthful for the next 7 years. So the context of the anchor, the IB is being really clear, page 20 of the guide. There's no prescribed way to teach the concepts, okay? So that means that we have to make a decision as authors as to how we're going to deliver the concepts. And we deliver them, first of all, we deliver them on every page. And Peter's going to talk a little bit about his chapter on concepts later. So we deliver them on every page, and we embed them into everything that we do in the book. So there's never a place in the book where the kids aren't thinking about concepts. And the other key point about the 3 C's from the IB is that they are not meant to be taught separately. Okay, so while we separate them in the book, because obviously we have to, as teachers, you should view the book as a toolkit for you to take and then put it all together yourself so that you can deliver a course. Okay, so some content's been removed, but according to the IB, you should be able to take most of your content from the old course and reimagine it for your new course. But obviously, when we wrote the book, we got rid of a lot of the old stuff we considered a bit stale, and we injected it with new stuff. We're going to talk a little bit about studies in a bit in terms of how we can use studies. All students now study all 4 of your contexts. There's no such thing as options anymore. Some of the options are being combined. So health and abnormal, I've gone into health and well-being. Learning and cognition, I've taken some of the things from the old social cultural and cognition and combined them. There's a lot of negativity regarding the guide, but once you start actually getting into it and planning your course, hopefully you'll see it as a new breath of fresh air and you'll have a very positive mindset with regarding it. I know there's a lot of anxiety regarding what some of this stuff looks like in the exam, but as I've said, Peter and I are going to provide lots of example answers and example questions as we go through the next few weeks and months. Yeah, the IB saying there's no prescribed way to do it. And so the question then becomes, if there's no prescribed way to do it, then how do we do it? So my idea with the concepts is that they should be delivered on a subheading level in the guide. So that's one of the things I'm delivering in workshops at the moment. So if you think about the guide in terms of subheading, the students should be able to look at 3 or 4 concepts on a subheading level every time they come across a subheading. And we'll talk a little bit about that later when we look at contexts. Okay, and then this is just about the changes to the papers, which you will be able to download. Okay, there's far too many. Here we go. Right, so this is what the book looks like. So I wrote the content sections, and we needed to present them in a pure form so that they could be delivered in a pure form, because if we combine them with the contexts, that would have been us prescribing the course for you, and that's not the point of the book. We can't design a course for you. That would be a course design, not a textbook. So we've written the 3 sections separately: content, contexts, and concepts. It will be up to you to combine them. We've kept the content sections symmetrical. We want students to grasp the foundations of each of the content sections. We've not overcooked on the studies. Students are not going to need to remember studies. But in terms of authors, we needed to show our studies in the textbook so that you as teachers can present it to students. This is how we know this to be true. So we had a discussion about this at the beginning of the project in terms of how much of studies are we going to write? And the answer is we still need studies in there to explain things. That's just good human science writing. And it's also obviously good TOK writing as well. We need to show how we know what we know. So there are studies in there, but we kept the studies relatively shorter than in the old textbook. And it's there for you teachers to show the students with confidence, this is how we know what we know. We also kept things, you can see on the screen that we've embedded conceptual questions all the way through the book. And we make sure that we're kind of interweaving them at correct places. We've had an IB overseer on our project, and that person was very instrumental in making sure that our concepts were fed through the book all the way through. When we come to the research methodology section, you have everything you need to deliver the research methodology course. We've got issues with graphs, you've got inferential statistics, you've got thematic analysis, critical thinking questions, and yes, we've got conceptual questions embedded through the research methodology section as well. So every part of the course is expected to have these concepts interwoven through it, and that's obviously you see on the screen, that's what the pages look like in the book. We've also got our TOK questions that's threaded through the book as well, so that you're never very far from embedding TOK into the new course as well. And then we have a separate standalone TOK chapter, which I wrote. And that's obviously, the book's been written from scratch. It was a blank page project. We started with a blank page. And obviously the new TOK guide from a couple of years ago is now being threaded through into this book. We have TOK questions in the book throughout, but we also have a separate TOK section as well. Okay. For me, writing the book, I'm obviously head of TOK at the school, and we wanted to make sure that all the activities in the book had classroom relevance. We wanted to make sure that we could imagine our own students doing it. Peter's a teacher as well. So we have these activities throughout the book as well, which are linked both to TOK and to learning, obviously in this case, research methods and learning the content. And then we've got a section on preparing you for assessment. This is quite static in the sense that it's not going to respond to examiner reports, which are going to come out in 2.5 years. What we will do is I'm talking to various people at IB at the moment with regards what assessments look like. And while I'm fairly kind of 99% sure what they look like, there's still a little bit of dynamism there in terms of what's happening in terms of student answers. And as we've said, we're preparing student answers that are going to go on the active learning ebook platform that Pearson's putting on there. But in the book, it's a rather static chapter on what to expect and how the students can prepare for it. And you can see that's paper 1. And then that brings me to the end of what I have to say. So just to summarize what I've said, first of all, these slides are available for download, and Peter and I will be answering your questions when you submit them. But the 3 C's are going to be what's going forward over the next 6 or 7 years or so. They're expected to be integrated, and the IB is saying that there's no one way to integrate them. I spoke to an individual recently, quite high up in the IB, and his response was that he's waiting for us teachers to see what we produce before he comes to a decision on what's good and what's bad. And that's great news, right? We should all just kind of like just go out there and prepare our courses and wait for the IB gods to wave their hand over our course and say yes or no. But I think he's quite a positive soul, quite a positive individual. But what you do need in your classrooms is a text with concrete answers to concrete questions, so that you can base your course in psychology literature that you know can be used in the exam situation. How we prepare students for the exam situation, that's going to be an ongoing conversation with the IB over the next at least the next few years or so. So with that, I hand over to Mr. Peter Giddens, and Peter, I'll be your that's my son calling. I'm so sorry. Peter, please start talking.
Am I on screen though? Christian, am I on the screen?
Yes, you are.
And Ilaria, can you move the slide forward?
I think Christian is going to move the slides.
Oh, okay.
Christian, could you move the slides? Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right. As the river shows, I'm just going to go with the flow. That was all I could think of saying. I'm going to be talking about the contexts, and the concepts. But I think from the very beginning, can I have the next slide, please, Christian? From the very beginning, I want to say that I sense a lot of anxiety about the new guide from comments on my IB and comments in workshops and so on. And after spending several months reading the guide again and again and again, I'm very happy to say that there's very little new information in the guide. Most of the content is what we have already been teaching, and it's really just a matter of reorganizing what we're teaching. And so in some ways, I think that this is an upgrade, a 1.1 version of the previous guide. I think we can all take some deep breaths and relax. It's not as big a deal as what some people are suggesting it is. Okay, so as Christian alluded to, the contexts are the anchor of the course. And you'll all see that the contexts are very similar to the options in the current guide. And it makes sense to be teaching the content and also the concepts in a context, in a relevant situation. So it makes sense to be talking about research studies relating to human relationships in the context of human relationships rather than standalone. Can I have the next slide, please? Thanks. So regarding the concepts, these are now formalized into the course, and probably they will be being discussed on a as they arose basis in the previous course. It would have been unusual to have been teaching about, for example, Zimbardo in the prison study without talking about responsibility and ethics and so on. But it was less explicit in the course. This time, the concepts and the conceptual thinking are much more explicit in the course, and therefore more explicit in the textbook. So we have 6 concepts. Just so you know, there are 10 fundamental concepts being taught in DP economics. So we get off quite lightly, really. And the concepts are very fundamental to anything that you would be teaching in any first-year psychology course. So I don't think that they're particularly unusual. And I do think it is good that they have been laid out very clearly for us all to be singing from the same song sheet. So I'm very positive about that. What we've tried to do in the textbook is to spread the conceptual thinking right throughout the book. Again, so that all the 3 C's are being, if not taught, at least discussed together. And that just makes common sense. That's how psychology exists in the world, and that probably is, as I understand it, is the basis of this expression called psychological literacy. Let me talk now about the conceptual questions. We've spread these through the book so that these are being the conceptual questions are being applied to the context and to the content. I hope that makes sense what I'm talking about there. Feel free to join in if you want to make a discussion. Let's have the next slide. Oh, you can't speak. Okay, so let's talk about the context. There's 4 contexts. I always felt a little bit disappointed that in the previous course, we could only teach 1 of the options to the standard level and 2 of the options to the higher level. And I felt that we were rather shortchanging the students by doing that. So it's good now that we get to teach all of those 4 contexts. Have the next slide. Thanks. As Christian mentioned, we still will be teaching key studies. It would be unusual to teach a first-year psychology course without mentioning social learning theory or social identity theory. They're really powerful studies, and it makes sense to be talking about them and including them in the course. Hopefully, though, we are moving away from memorizing a structured outline without any sort of understanding. And I hope that applies to the whole course, that we're moving away from memorized template sort of answers. Let's have the next slide. Each of the contexts has one of the practicals associated with it. In the fine print of the guide, although the practicals appear to be allocated to a context, it's not essential that you only apply, say, the experiment to the learning and cognition context. You can apply them to whichever one you want. The context, the in-class practicals I see as being an excellent opportunity to scaffold and to support the students as they lead into their internal assessments. And I think probably those in-class practicals and the internal assessment are probably what will drive my decision as to how to structure the course. I like to get the internal assessment out of the way in the first year, and so probably I would want to start teaching with the learning and cognition context, but I haven't really decided yet. I really like that idea of a practical in the context, and so we'll be doing 4 of them. You need to read the fine print in the subject guide. Those practicals don't have to be done by the student. They can be done by the teacher, and I can well imagine a situation where some of those practicals will be done by me as the teacher, using the students as either assistants or as the participants in the studies. And I can see myself, at least in the first year, reusing some of my old material from experiments with the internal assessments, at least till I get more comfortable with the course. Christian, can I have the next slide, please? How to put this? Although we have created the textbook in separate sections and the subject guide is created in separate sections, it's really important that we teach all of the content and context and concepts together, but only where it makes sense. And so the way I'm approaching constructing my course is to start with a context that I want to do. And I'm thinking I will start with learning and cognition. because I want to do the internal assessment based on an experiment. And then I am looking through the rest of the course and asking what concepts apply best to the learning and cognition context, and what content applies best to that, and including in that content, which of the research methods do I think fits most appropriately into that context. And one of my activities has involved some big pieces of paper and some little pieces of paper, cutting out learning objectives and dropping them onto the big pieces of paper. Inevitably, I'm going to end up with 4 different sized contexts or topics or units or however I want to talk about it. But that doesn't matter. I think that the course now allows us to teach psychology in a much more natural, normal way. Let's have the next slide. Oh, am I finished? I am. Let's have some questions then.
Hi, Peter and Christian. It's Catherine here
Hi,
from
Catherine.
Pearson. So we had some questions that came in ahead of time, and we also have some that have come in as you've been talking. I've tried to kind of group them, so I'll just read them out to you and let you answer. So, with regards to not memorizing studies, do students still need to include descriptions of studies in SAQs and ERQs?
Okay, so first of all, there's no SAQs or ERQs anymore. So we're going to go to 4 markers, 6 markers, and 15 markers. And those are going to have different skill sets attached to them. The problem is that because we've now got different skill set, on the old guide, you had basically 2 skill sets. You had an SAQ and an ERQ, and you could teach those 2 skill sets. And with this guide, you've got different skill set for 4 markers, 6 markers, and 15 markers. And I'm playing around with it at the moment in terms of what I'm going to deliver in September. I'll put all my thinking on the Pearson website. I'll put it into a teacher-friendly and then a student-friendly package. But it is quite complex for a student to sit in a lesson when they're doing 6 DP subjects and now they've got all these different skills attached to psychology, where in the old days it was just 2 skills. So back to the studies. The room for studies in answers is minimal. You don't need, the only place you're going to need it is paper 1, section A, and that's going to be a very tight, short answer. I've pulled it down to, I think, 10 minutes, so that's about 200 words. Yeah, and you probably get away with doing about 8 minutes in terms of answering. So the answer is you don't need many studies. The rest of the time, you are talking about concepts in the context with a small c of the contexts and the content. So that's going to be the exam skill set. And yes, you need knowledge of research, but it's going to be minimal in terms of the exam space. So we lay out, as I've said when I was talking, we lay out in the book because we kind of have to. It's good, just good TOK thinking. We need to show you why we know what we know and how we know it. But in terms of what the students take into the exam, it's going to be minimal.
Thanks, Christian. So there were a couple of questions about planning the course. One person asked about whether it's possible to teach the course in 1 year, and if so, would you suggest any strategies? And somebody else asked how to plan the course over 2 years. To what extent is selective study possible for the student?
Okay, so Peter, I'll go first maybe. So I said when I was talking that you should view the course. You could view the course in terms of relative symmetrical blocks. And those symmetrical blocks can be labeled contexts. Peter might disagree with me, but I think you agree with me. So the context is the anchor. So you've got your 4 anchors, and then around that, you're going to input your content and your concepts. But view the course as 4 symmetrical chunks. I'm saying relative symmetrical chunks because health and well-being has an extra subheading, whereas the others don't. But it's relatively symmetrical. All right, so you've got your 4 symmetrical chunks. Obviously, I can't answer the question on camera now because I don't know what your school timetable looks like or what your week by week, day by day planner looks like. But so far, the timings that have been made available by the IB are, in my view, very doable. And if you can fit those timings into your school year, then please go ahead. But if you wanted to think about, the 4 symmetrical chunks plus the IA, as Peter says, you interweave your research methods into your contexts. So if you think about it as 4 symmetrical chunks of knowledge, and then you could obviously, if you're doing a 2-year course, it would be 2 in year 1 and then 2 in year 2. And then you've got your IA somewhere parachuted into there as well, possibly as a break between two contexts. So I can't answer that question in terms of a year. I wouldn't envy anybody trying to do it in a year, but if you do, you'd have to do 2 before Christmas and then 2 after, wouldn't you? In the Northern Hemisphere. Peter, what do you think about that? Can you do it in a year?
I wouldn't try to do it in a year. I've always been skeptical of the 1-year program, partly because as a DP coordinator, one of the things you have to do at authorization and reauthorization time is to assure the IB that you're doing concurrency of learning over 2 years, and that surely rules out doing them in 1 year, but apparently that rule doesn't apply to everybody. The obvious question to ask, though, is how many hours a week are you being allocated to teach that? And if you've got double the number of hours that you would have if you were doing it over 2 years, then yes, of course, it's perfectly doable. There is another question, though, the maturity of the students. And so are we talking about 16, 17, or 18 years old? That's another factor. But the most obvious question is how many hours a week are you being allocated?
Which they can't answer now. Catherine, next question.
Thank you. Yeah, okay, next question. So Roshini asked, can you give an example of facilitating the integration of contents, concepts, and contexts?
Ooh, that's a great question off the top of my head. So if you, Peter, do you want to answer that while I go and get some paperwork?
Oh, I thought you were going to say while you're going to make a cup of tea.
I've got it somewhere. I just need to, I could just reach for it. Do you want me to reach for it? Just 1 second.
Yeah, okay. I'll sing a song while you're away. Catherine, what was the question again, please? How to combine...
The question was, can you give an example of facilitating the integration of contents, concepts, and contexts?
No? Okay, so go ahead, sorry.
I was repeating the question, sorry.
All right, so look, so I printed out all of the content, and then I printed out the contexts. And then I did I did forwards planning, and I did backwards planning. And so that I made sure that I could tick everything off. So for example, I've got cognitive biases in decision-making. I've got the role of anchoring bias in decision-making for my learning objective. And then I've got the role of environmental factors I've related to operant conditioning. And some of them fit very, very easily. And if you look also within the contexts, you've already, in many of the subheadings, you've got that natural alternative explanations. And in the guide, they've carried over at least 2 natural critical thinking concepts with a small c. So number 1, alternative explanations. So whenever you see examples of alternative explanations, that immediately feeds into the concept of perspective. So you're going to have to read the related terms under each concept. So for example, under perspective, you've got this idea of alternative explanations. And then in the context, you've got this idea, for example, of rival treatment, competing treatments, competing explanations. And that's from the old guide where you would compare, for example, biological treatments with psychological treatments. It's the same. And as Peter said, they've just carried it over from the old guide. And then the second thing they brought over is reductionism, which was a natural part of the biological perspective. And then the third thing they brought over is areas of uncertainty. So that's under this idea of critical thinking. So whenever students have finished an essay and they've discussed very briefly, because there isn't much room, the longest answer is going to be 15 marks, which I'm putting at about 40 minutes, 45 minutes max. So if you're writing for 40 minutes, that's not much room. So at the end of the essay, you've got, in my view, you can do a natural conclusion where you bring in areas of uncertainty. So it's, as I said at the beginning when I was talking, they kind of taken the old guide, they ripped it up, and then they've thrown it in the air. And then it's kind of like jigsaws confetti's come down, and now you've got to kind of put it together again. But you can put it together again however you kind of want, as long as you follow those 4 basic contexts, you should be fine. So when you're planning your course, tick off, like I've done, all the content and the content learning outcomes, tick them all off. And then the context learning outcomes, tick them all off. And they are not symmetrical. I forget the numbers, but it's not symmetrical. So it's not like 20 goes into 20. It's something like 33 goes into 24 or something like that. So you have to double up some of them, and some of them naturally double up more than others. But don't be afraid to reuse, and keep your eye on the end point, good old-fashioned backwards planning, which is how the students will write it in the exam. So on the e-book platform, Active Learning, we will put example answers, and you will be able to see the end point. This is what students are expected to write in the exam. So I'm writing at the moment spec questions, and I'm writing answers to those spec questions, and they're all going to go on the ebook platform. All right, Peter, sorry, I probably talked too much.
No, it's okay. When you talk about dropping content into contexts, I think I remember health and well-being, pretty much all of the biological approach learning objectives drop nicely into the health and well-being. They mash up. And there are, of course, several learning objectives that are common to both the context and the content. Then it's a matter of which of the research methods go best where. And I think that the IB has already done that for us by allocating the practical. I think what Christian has just described is probably a good answer to that question. Catherine, do you want to come with another one?
Yep, so there's been a couple of questions related to HL. So what does it mean that HL students need to go deeper for HL extensions? And regarding the HL extensions, it seems that there is a lot of material that needs to be covered. Do we need to cover it all?
Okay, it's a great question, and Peter and I have talked about this. In the guide, and it's a shame we haven't got the guide on screen, but in the guide, you'll see that it's underneath each HL extension, you've got those bullet points. And in the book, we cover it all, right? Because we have to. But as teachers, the question then becomes how much for how much, right? So how much are you going to need and how much you're going to get marked on it. So the HL extensions, paper 3, as I've said in my little discussion, the only place you're going to need it in depth is question 4. And then the question becomes how much of question 4. And if you start planning your own answers, and I encourage all teachers to do this, I know we're all busy, but if you start planning your own answer before you teach it, certainly before the summer, hopefully, you will notice that they don't actually need that much in their paragraphs. And so the IB have given those example areas of study in the HL extensions. You don't need to teach them all. They're just example areas. And you could kind of like combine them all into a big picture idea, and then teach that big picture idea. So for example, how does culture influence treatment? That's a big picture idea, for example. And in the exam, this is because I've been writing spec questions recently. The big problem I had with writing spec questions was the IB is going to find it really difficult to write questions that are general enough that every student can answer them, because all teachers are going to be teaching their own courses. And so these spec questions are going to have to be very, very general. They have to be general, because they can't predict what you're going to teach. Just to leave out the HL extensions for a minute, they can't predict what you're going to teach in terms of the context and the content and the concepts. They don't know what you're going to teach. So the questions have to be so general that they have to be able to apply their knowledge. So I think the big theme of the guide is going to be application. So students have to be, that's why I said at the beginning, it was the 4th C, confident. The students have to be confident in applying their psychology literacy to different situations. So if you teach a general HL extension that acknowledges and tips your hat to the message in the guide, so for example, culture and treatment, for example, you will be fine. But the key thing is not just to teach the content with a small c, it's to give them that extra confidence so that students can then say, okay, I'm confident with this. I can now apply it to a different situation, which is kind of similar to what my teacher taught me, but not exactly the same, because the IB is not going to know what you teach them. And every teacher is going to be teaching a different course. So the questions have to be general enough. So give them the confidence to apply their knowledge and give them lots of practice questions. Where's the practice questions, you say? Well, we'll put it on the Pearson website, but the IB is not exactly being very generous with it at the moment. Peter.
I recall that when we were writing the context chapters of the book, that the HL extension certainly gave me a lot of grief, and I spent a lot of time sitting on my balcony thinking about, how to convert what's written in the guide to something that goes in the book. And Christian has summed it up nicely. What I've done is write an example, and students might come up with their own example. And I can imagine a teacher perhaps presenting what's in the textbook and sending the students off on a self-study journey for a couple of weeks to create their own version of something similar to what's in the textbook. So the idea is that they can eventually go off to the exam and write about, for example, culture in one of the contexts. And what the question might be, it has to be very general. They can't possibly ask a very specific question on that, the way the guide is written. And it would be something along the lines of write about culture in the health and well-being context, or write about technology in the health and well-being context. When I took that approach and went off and looked at research, there are some exceptionally interesting research studies out there. And at the time, I remember thinking this would likely trigger many students to come back to the teacher and say, can I write my extended essay on something about this? Now, I see it more as an opportunity to send students off and do a self-study, which might help the people who are short of time. Catherine?
Thank you. Yeah. So now some questions about kind of assessments and that kind of thing. So firstly, about the practicals. So somebody asked, how in-depth and detailed do the practical assignments need to be? Are they in effect mini IAs? How should they be guided? And then a related question, can you throw some light on the experiments that are to be conducted? There is some ambiguity if it's to be done in groups.
All right, Peter, do you want to get the technical answer to that group one with it? And then I'll talk generally a little bit. So the answer to the question is, again, we're asking how much for how much, right? So how much do the students have to know? How much are they going to write? And how much marks are they going to get at the end of that? So it's good old-fashioned backwards planning. So if you go to paper 2, that's where the students will be asked about their CP knowledge. And again, the answers are in, if you don't mind, Catherine, I'm just going to flick this screen. It's going to be a little bit... So we go back to paper 2. The answer, here we are. So the answers, no. The answers are, so look, knowledge and understanding of the research method is 4 marks. And they've got 6 minutes, in my opinion. The 4 marks is IB, 6 minutes, that's 6 minutes is me. So the answer is not a lot, right? In terms of their understanding of the research method. They've got to write about it for 6 minutes. But they have to write about, so they'll have to have knowledge of all the research methods that allows them to write about the research methods for 6 minutes. So they're going to have some kind of revision platform that allows them to store their knowledge of the CP and allow them to write about the method in 6 minutes. And I'll put some platforms that I've already created on the Pearson platform. I hand it out at workshops as well. It's just basically a blank document with a framework on it. For example, it'll say, what method did you use? And then 1B, again, 6 minutes, knowledge of the concepts in your class practical. So in my view, they should have all 6 concepts applied to each class practical, and they should have a good chunky paragraph for each concept that's applied to their class practical. So they can write intelligently, whichever concept the IB asks for, they can write intelligently about it. So they are revising that 4 times, because they've obviously got 4 contexts and 4 CPs. And then compare and contrast similarities, the method in your CP with another one. So now they have to have knowledge of the other CPs. But here we've given them the 15 minutes to write. So they have to say similar things and then different things. So compare and contrast. So they have to understand the basic points of each method. So you're looking at 2 or 3 characteristics of each method. So 2 or 3 characteristics of an experiment versus 2 or 3 characteristics of an observation. And then 1D, design a further study. So they have to go into the exam knowing that they're going to be asked to design a further study and to investigate the same topic you addressed in your class practical with another method. So you're preparing them in class to prepare for that question, so that they know that they're going to have to do the same topic again, but in the form of another method. Sorry, so many kids were trying to get in the classroom. And then finally, the final section, section B. Again, it's application. So they're going to have the confidence. They're going to be given concepts, and they're going to have to apply that to a hidden, to a source study. So the only place they're going to remember their CP is section A, 1A, 1B, 1C, 1D. And, you know, the questions are there already for them. So you can, and I've given you the timings. And if you imagine 200 words, 20 words a minute average writing speed, then the answer is not a lot. And at the sound, you know, that I don't want to repeat myself. And the answer, the TOK question then becomes, what do you mean by not a lot? And at the moment, that's all I'm willing to go. Right. That's the only place I can go to at the moment is the mark band and then the timing. And then in the future, we're going to put example answers on the Pearson platform. Peter.
First of all, Alessandra, I saw a message pop up there, a question. Yes, the video is being recorded. It'll be available later. The internal assessment is not a group activity anymore. It's done as an individual. And the class practical can be done as a group, as an individual. It can also be done with the teacher doing it and the students watching, or the teacher doing it and the students helping to do it, or some students being participants and some being researchers. For example, if you were doing interviews, some might be the interviewer, some might be the interviewee. It's all very flexible. There seem to be no you must nots. It seems to be do it as you would like. We've given examples of how to do these in the book, and the semi-static questions that are there on the screen right now are the very best of the guides as to what the student should be doing. And then also in the follow-up discussions following actually doing that, what notes you might have the students write in their books, particularly the role of the buyer, the role of the concept in that practical. So they need to be able to substitute in that concept, each of those 6 concepts into the question that's there in front of you now.
You can imagine doing imagine doing a spider diagram, or you know, to make it in different colors. So you can have your research method at the center, then you can have surround it with all the different other research methods that you could have done. Then you could have another page, your concepts at the center, and then all your concepts spiraling out in terms of how the concepts apply to your CP. But that's backwards planning. You start with the paper, and then you pull out. And you know, I don't want to. I think it was Paul Daniels who kept with not a lot. I don't want to sound like Paul Daniels if you get that joke, but not a lot is the answer. But I don't want everyone going away saying, "Oh, Christian Bryan says you don't need that much." The answer to any question regarding how much is contained in that paper 2, paper 1, and paper 3 questions. And I've given you the timings on the far right.
Thank you. So there are more questions, but I'm aware that Christian needs to head off. So I'm going to hand back to Lara to wrap up, but we will do an FAQs document that covers all of the questions that have been answered and haven't been answered, and that will be linked to in the follow-up emails